Hello and welcome. We're excited to continue the Future of Work conversation as part of the Techlandia Summit and Design Sprint. We'll have staff letting people in as folks get in out of the waiting room, but in the meantime, I'm going to do some rules of engagement. My name is Skip Newberry. I'm President and CEO of Technology Association of Oregon, and I'll be your facilitator for this session, along with Riley O'Brien, who's our Vice President of Events and Experiences, and she'll be coordinating things on the back end for us. A couple of rules of engagement before we start. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute until a TAO staff member calls on you and asks you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to me or to TAO admin, and we'll continue to monitor the chat box throughout the discussion. We'll ask you all to please engage via the participant icon on your screen. And please engage with us on social media throughout the session. We're excited to share what's happening throughout the Techlandia Summit and get participant takeaways from the sessions. This session is also being recorded, and it'll be found on TAO's YouTube channel within 24 hours of this event, as well as shared throughout our various online communities. A huge thank you to all the investors in Techlandia Summit and the Design Sprint. So we have PSU, AT&T, PGE, Google, Comcast, Autodesk, Portland Trailblazers, and League of Oregon Cities. We appreciate their sponsorship and are also excited to explore topics related to economic resiliency, future of work, human factors, and mobility throughout this week. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Roz Hudnell, who's retired president of the Intel Foundation and vice president of human resources at Intel. Roz, we're really pleased to have you with us, and we're going to move to a breakout session after this where we can continue an informal conversation if folks so desire. And Lemore Schaffman, who's part of the Global City Teams Challenge, which is a NIST initiative federally, will be helping to facilitate that. And so Roz, wanted to cede the floor to you, and maybe you could open it up with some remarks, and then we'll start chatting and see where things go from there.
Great. Good morning, and thank you, Skip. I'm really honored to be speaking with you all today. I have worn my Oregon green for the state of Oregon, near and dear to our family's hearts. So what I wanted to do today was just set some context for us to think about this, and then provide you with some of my perspectives, and then move into what I hope will be a very helpful, a very candid, a very robust Q&A. As we move forward this morning. And the reason why I think it's important to set where we are in context is because I do believe that it's exactly why we're in the situation that we're in. So if you think about it, most of you now, unless you have not been engaged in any type of news, know more about June 19th, 1865 than you ever did. And that's a good thing. But it's interesting how many people in 2020 didn't know as much about that story. Some people may not know that 100 years later, 1965, when I was a little girl, that was really the end of Jim Crow. So if you think about 100 years, you get to 1965, which happened to be the year when President Johnson literally signed in the Executive Order 11246, which really required government contractors, which was pretty much any major company that was doing any type of business, to have to take affirmative steps in order to close representation gaps. And what's important to understand about that is, think about that, that's in 1965. So it's kind of the first law coming out of 100 years of Jim Crow, when the government said, we want you to do better, and we want you to take affirmative steps. It actually did not dictate quotas, contrary to popular belief. It didn't dictate quotas, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So 1965, we're there, and then 1968. What's really critical about that year for me personally is it's the year that Intel was founded. It's also the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. But it's also the year that gender was added to the executive order, putting women and gender in the affirmative action law. And data will show you that women, Caucasian women, have advanced more through affirmative action than the demographic that the original law was designed for. So just keep that in mind. Then you get to 1978, right? That was the landmark Bakke decision, right? And then you begin to see people begin to push on preferences, and it was generally always around race. It generally has not been around gender, even though gender was part of that law. 1979, China opens up to foreign investment. And what does that mean? It means companies are beginning to think foreign investment, consumers beginning to be a little bit more global. Understand our issues with race still have not been fully addressed in the workplace or even in society. Then in 1987, some of you may remember this, many of you may not. You probably are a lot younger than I am, but that was when Workforce 2000 came out. And that was the report from the Department of Labor that said by the year 2000, the number of net entrants into the workplace, the net new entrants, would be majority women and minorities. That began to then have this perspective of diversity, and diversity being broad demographic spectrum. Remember, we still have not closed our gaps on race as related to African Americans in this country, while we're beginning to think more globally, why gender's been added, while we begin to look at what's going on with globalization, with immigration, with a variety of activities. 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and you can begin to see that companies and globalization begins to be a huge part of the progress. Technology is still advancing. You have Moore's law that's continuing to advance and advance and advance. And then what happens in 1999, 2000, we have this term called the digital divide that comes up, because what's happened is the economy, the innovation in technology, and how businesses and wealth is being created, how opportunities, it really is through, if you remember, the ability to have access to technology. And in this country, when you got into brown and black communities, that access did not exist. And that's really the first time that Reverend Justin Jackson came into Silicon Valley and talked about the lack of support for Silicon Valley companies, Intel included, for not being involved and supporting urban communities, black communities, brown communities. 2005, you flip forward. By now, we've had many, many generations of iPhones, right? The iPhone came out in about that 2005. We have apps. Remember 5,000, 1,000 songs in your pocket. But what it meant through Moore's law was technology in people's hands. The ability for people to have ubiquitous access through a cell phone. And then the cell phone became as much about the camera as it became about the apps. And you flip forward now to 2015, it's been 10 years and Intel has been sharing data, right? Focus on diversity and inclusion. 2015, the CEO at the time, Brian Krasanich, gets up on the stage of CES and says, we are going to help lead the industry and we're going to close our representation gaps. Last year, Intel reported that the gaps were closed, but also reported that that was based on a market availability number and that there was still work to do. And here we are at 2020. So ladies and gentlemen, what I would tell you is, number one, we are here because of Moore's Law. We are here because of Martin Luther King, because without Martin Luther King, there's no Barack Obama. And I don't want to get political, but without Barack Obama, you don't get Trump. It's all connected, but what's really connected is this thing called the camera on a phone. And what began to happen is we began to see things with our eyes, the absolute images. And you have to remember that I just went through from 1965, end of Jim Crow. Jim Crow ended in my lifetime. So to think that I could rise to be at an Intel as an executive is a tremendous accomplishment. I'm proud of that, but I'm an anomaly. That's not the norm. And so when you have populations and demographics who are feeling and seeing something that others don't feel and see, and there's been a lot of work and a lot of work and a lot of work, but the gap has never been closed. The racial gap in this country has never been closed. When you look at all socioeconomic factors, behind, and then we get to COVID. And you know the narrative around COVID. And then you continue. And so it's an interesting dynamic right now in that we have such a huge opportunity, but it's another wake-up call in that it is now staring us all in the face because images have shaped our country. And the image of George Floyd took most people, the amount of time, it just took most people to a level of indignation. Some that it was the last drop and the cup is spilled over. And some that thought and looked at the world as half full of opportunity realized, well, that's not for everyone. And the reason why that's important is we're sitting here now talking about how we drive inclusion in what is an incredibly chaotic world. And I believe, and I've always believed, and I've said this over the past few years, I believe this truly is a slingshot moment for the country. And if you look, perhaps the world, have finally seen that race is not just in the United States. When I would travel around the world, I would have people tell me that's a US issue. And yet when I was in, you name the country, and I talked with people that had my skin color, if not darker, it was the same issue, just under a different context. And so when I say slingshot moment, if you think about a slingshot, the farther you pull it back when you let go, the farther it advances. So we are going to advance. We have seen monumental change. We have seen people step up and have monumental change. And it has been driven a lot by millennials. Millennials are what data told us the Gen X was supposed to be. The group of young people who really, quite frankly, in my opinion, are sick and tired of us adults. They really are. And they have grown up in a world where they have not seen us at our best, even those that loved Obama, even under his time. And so what you have now is this incredible two worlds. When we talk about the future of work, see, I want us to all remember this is a very privileged conversation because we literally told the lowest workers in some communities that they were essential and sent those who had the technology access and who had the educational achievement and who had the jobs and the work home to the comforts of their home to keep their jobs, keep their salary, and work from home. I'm not saying that's a cakewalk or easy, but I want us to think about the two worlds that we have continued to create in what was the essential jobs and who works in those essential jobs and who doesn't work in those essential jobs. So when we talk about the future of work, we have to understand that it's got to be a conversation that looks at all workers. It has to be a conversation that looks at the reality of who is going to continue to be able to be economically sufficient, physically safe, and able to achieve the American dream through this. And so the future of work for me is a privileged conversation, but it's an important and necessary conversation. And so from a CEO standpoint, I think to myself most days, I am really, really relieved that I'm not the vice president of HR for Intel right now, because the needs and the amount of money companies are going to need to spend to keep their employees safe, to keep their facilities clean, to deal with COVID coming out is going to be huge. And they're going to have to account for that. They're going to have to account for policies around people who don't feel safe to come back to work. If you don't believe that, look at what's happening with our professional sports teams right now. And players basically saying, I'm high risk. I'm not going to come play for the NBA. Or this is the only month that I can see my child, so I can't come play, but you still have to pay me. So what is interesting now is I think about this and I think, wow, I think we should start thinking about the future of work from the worker's point of view. Because when I looked at the Fortune, the CEO study that was done in Fortune, published a few days ago, it was very much from a CEO standpoint. 62% are really going to invest more in addressing social issues. It talked about their number one issues of concern. It went down a variety of things. About a third are looking at, workforce actions sometime later this year. It talked about, about a third believe that, telecommuting will continue to be a major part of their organization. And it looked at what you would expect CEOs to answer. But what was missing for me that I want all of you to think about? But what about the workers? My understanding is it takes adults 7 weeks to learn a new habit. We have sent workers home. And we have told them it's okay to work from home because we're in the middle of COVID. And increasingly, they're performing. And I was talking to a really senior level Black exec who I mentor. And he told me he was frustrated. And I said, I gave him a little feedback. And he said, you know what? He said, but I'm not stressed. He said, because this company doesn't step up, I can get a job on Zoom within the week. And I thought to myself, he's right. Because what if geography isn't necessarily a factor in why employees stay where they stay? And if geography becomes not a huge factor in where the future of work is, what does that mean for recruitment, retention, and development? And what does that mean for top talent? If they truly can do their work from anywhere, which is what we've talked about in our technological world, even though companies didn't necessarily embrace it as much. But what if? Future of work. What is the future of work when literally your best employees can say, you know what, I worked for the last 2 months from home and I actually don't want to drive across the bridge for 2 hours a day, both ways. I actually don't want to miss dinner with my children every day like I have been for the last 3 years. I really don't want to live that life anymore. So when I look at the future of work, there's the future of work from a CEO standpoint and a business leader standpoint as it relates to how work will be distributed, how many people you'll need, all of the things that you would think a CEO would need, how much money you're going to still spend on commercial real estate, what are you going to do on globalization, how are you dealing with opening up around the world, all of those things, right? How much with security, people literally logging in from home, and how do you deal with that? But I also think there's this future of work that we really are not paying enough attention to, which is the future of what workers want. The millennial generation is the generation that is going to demand certain things and is likely the ones that if they don't get it may actually protest against you and dare you not to keep sending them a paycheck. That's different. So as I step back and think about, so what does this mean for diversity and inclusion? Do you guys remember back in the day when the internet was supposed to become the great equalizer? It was supposed to actually help with inclusion. It was going to help advance diversity because it was going to become ubiquitous. It was going to become an even level playing field. I remember sitting in rooms saying, I'm not sure about that. And what happened? What it gave us was the opportunity to pick which communities, to pick which news, to pick which people we follow so that we could get reinforced in our beliefs all day long. It did the exact opposite. So I think to myself, so if everybody's gone home And I will say, the reason why diversity is hard inside of businesses is because businesses are trying to do what the world is still trying to do, right? I used to always say inside of Intel, and the engineers hated this, but I said it anyway because they never gave me data that said I was wrong. I said diversity is harder than rocket science. It is harder than rocket science because with rocket science, there is at least a manual. With rocket science, at least if you have the right ingredients, the right skills, all of those things, and you have the right weather conditions, generally speaking, the rocket should launch. We don't do a lot because it's incredibly expensive. But diversity, there is no perfect manual. There is no perfect manual to overcome the fact that Jim Crow ended in my lifetime. That you had 400 years where a segment of people that we're trying to include were treated as pretty much less than humans. And so people used to talk about diversity fatigue. And I would say, how can you be tired? I'm tired. My grandmother was tired. Her parents were tired. This is too new. So if you think about now, will it help? And I've really been thinking, will it help that now we are going to have more people working from home? You aren't necessarily going to have the same type of social in-person networks for a while, the little whispers, but I'm not sure, because let me tell you what Zoom and WebEx is. It's a close-up of what the organization currently looks like. It is a close-up. I have been on WebEx meetings where I was the only Black person, and I knew that I was dialing into the meeting, but when you stare at those faces back at you on a screen, it's a close-up. I'm not sure if that is driving more inclusion in the back of our brains, but it is something for us to recognize. It won't automatically fix it. Okay. So if that's the case, where might we be? And this is what I believe. I believe that the workplace through Zoom is not diverse racially. I believe that the world through millennials is incredibly more diverse. And what has been fascinating to me is to watch how they have communicated around protests, around taking down Trump's rally, around pictures, around videos. There is a whole background thing going on. And what they do is the minute adults take over their platform, they move to another one. And so I have hope. I have hope that now that we all recognize the challenges and we recognize the reality, we will be able to be much more bold and much more unapologetic about focusing on race. Intel drove, when I took over as the Chief Diversity Officer, a focus on race in 2005. And my chief diversity colleagues thought I was crazy. And I said to them, I said, look, it's not our only focus. I said, Intel is a leader in many, many things, but as with anything in a company, where you have gaps, you put focus. This is the same thing. You can't drive an inclusion strategy where you think everybody is going to feel the same and be included when you have segments of your population that aren't even represented. You cannot include who you don't have. So in a meeting, if there's only one Black person on the team, I'm not sure what you can do to have that person fully feel included, because on that call, every single time they're having a meeting, it's a subconscious, I'm the only one. And then that goes through an incredible do loop. But what I do think is this, I think CEOs, I actually am incredibly optimistic The millennials I talk to are not, by the way, but I am incredibly optimistic because I think what you saw post George Floyd was kind of the old playbook. CEOs would come out with their statements and big donations. And let me tell you, their in-towner workforce, particularly their Black workforce, it was like a tsunami back on them, right? Because the reality was, you can't say Black Lives Matter and not have a focus on the Black lives inside your organization. So it's great that you went and gave $5 million to the Equal Justice Initiative, but we want some equal justice in our workplace. And what I have seen is CEOs not pivot, but be reminded, because many of them thought they were doing the work. And what they now realize is, wow, I needed to be much more intentional, much more deliberate in my drive to focus on inclusion, which is absolutely the goal. Again, Jim Crow ended in 1965. The executive order to address that was signed in 1965. We have never fully addressed the initial law. And that is literally why we continue to be where we are when you look at every single index. And so I'm focusing there today because I don't want to talk broad diversity inclusion today, because I think that conversation will continue to be there, whether I'm on this screen or not. What I want us to do is finally do the work that we were supposed to do in 1965. So that when you see the representation of Blacks in C-suite, on boards, all throughout the company, it won't just be a handful. I can count and not use all my fingers the number of Black CEOs of major Fortune 100 companies, and I wouldn't use all my fingers on one hand. Jim Crow ended in 1965. So this is, though, what I actually believe. I have been so encouraged by the phone calls and the emails and the reach outs from people in a real historic way. People who have incredible responsibilities, who really want to help and want to do something incredibly different. And that is where we can all start. And so I think that what I will say is the time for incremental change is over. We have been doing incremental change since 1965. And every time we started to do something bold, whether it be through a political momentum or lack of momentum, whether it be through a Supreme Court landmark case that advanced it or didn't advance it, it's been incremental, incremental, incremental. And what you saw and what we've seen is that people, and if you looked at who was in that protest, it was incredibly multicultural. And it was incredibly young. They're done with incremental because they have not lived their lives in incremental. This is not the trophy generation. This is the generation who has watched Americans really go backwards. They've watched wars, and they have watched it all on what? Their cell phone, and they filmed it. So there was an old song that basically said the revolution will be televised. It is being televised in people's hands 24/7. And I believe that a combination of CEOs that really do recognize they must do something differently, millennials who are going to demand it, and all of us in between there who literally now are waking up to understand the impact of bias, whether it be unconscious, subconscious, the impact of laws, the impact of policy. I think we will be able to finally perhaps get to what has always been known as that mediocre middle when it relates to the commitment to diversity in our organization and in our societies, and push from both sides. So I'm going to pause, Skip, because I've been talking for a long time and I want to hear questions. Thank you.
That sounds great. That was really both a nice summary, I think, of where we've come and where we haven't, and where there's still so much more work to do. And I think there were elements of what is possible as well in that. And you know, in terms of your background, you have a really interesting perspective in that you've led a corporate foundation that is very important. You have, you know, been in charge of HR at a major multinational corporation in tech. And you've also been really instrumental in kind of setting up and leading diversity initiatives within a large distributed multinational. And with each of those functions, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role that each can play in having an impact that is transformational rather than incremental, in responding to some of these trends, especially the millennials driving a lot of this change. Like in each of those roles, how would someone in your shoes respond if you were advising them?
So let me start with kind of somewhat, it's not easy, but the one that is the expectation, right? From a foundation, right? A foundation takes dollars and invests in communities and doesn't get a business benefit from it, right? And in return, the IRS allows it to be tax exempt. And so the writing of checks and really putting a name behind certain things, I think is critically important. And that still has to happen. The challenge with foundations now is that, you know, foundations get to choose where they put their money, and that's the reality. And so what you're finding is even after billions and billions of dollars being spent on foundations, there's only so much a foundation can do. Needed and necessary. And so heading up a foundation, the reality is right now, I'd just be doing all I could to write bigger checks to issues that would help fix this. Organizations and people and leaders who would help fix this. So that would be number one. The interesting thing from an HR perspective is I met with, I don't know, probably about 50 chief human resources officers a couple weeks ago. And I basically said to them, I said, I know this is not easy, and I don't even know if I could get it done, but I think this is an opportunity to reimagine everything. Reimagine compensation from a distributed workforce that may be working totally from home. Reimagine benefits. What have we realized with COVID? What we have realized is lack of healthcare is a direct correlation to our health disparities. And in this country, healthcare still primarily is driven through our employees or your ability to write a check. So it leaves poor people out. But in many communities, I led some research with the Center for Talent Innovation, which talked about leadership in our mess, and it talked about Black executives and the reality that so many of us, our family is distributed. And I've always wondered, and I always thought that it's perhaps time that employers allow employees to choose who their dependents are, regardless of whether they're married to them, whether they birth them, whether they're a sister, an auntie, a grandmother. I do believe that it's time for us to totally rethink everything. I think performance management systems need to continue to be thought of differently. You know, the minute you put somebody on camera, think about the stress for some people where they're seeing, I was on a call and a person was in their wine cellar and somebody else was sitting at their kitchen table. And I thought, I wonder how both of those people feel, if they even recognize that even through Zoom, people can display economic disparity. And what does that mean? Like when you go into a workplace, historically, everybody at Intel, we all had a cubicle, right? Well, all of a sudden, I've got to think, how is it now doing Zoom, where people aren't doing it from cubicles, they're doing it from their homes. So there is this aspect of rethink everything. But what I will tell you is, the thing that I learned, I was Intel's first chief diversity officer, and I'm proud of the work I did. I think my lasting legacy beyond, you know, the data and the strategy that still lives to today, The foundation is that when I retired, diversity didn't retire with me. It has been a business objective and a focus that is increased through a CEO transition. It is increased through Barb Y, who was my mentee and is the Chief Diversity Officer for the company and one of the Vice President of HR. She's leading it. And so when I think about that, I think about perhaps that's what I want leaders to understand is I believe one of the biggest challenges we've had with diversity, particularly around race, is it's always been one or two. And when those one or two leave, unfortunately, there weren't one or two to replace them, or there weren't 10 to replace them. And so it's almost like climbing up a ladder and then falling back down, and then climbing up a ladder and then falling back down. So pipeline, I think, is critical. I think accelerating talent is going to be critical. I think performance management and talent management during this time is going to be critical. And I believe that leaders have to be unapologetic about going after their greatest gaps. And for the most part, it's African American and Black employees. I have looked at data from I can't tell you how many companies, and that is always, with the exception of one company, the greatest gap. So when I look at it from those perspectives, Skip, I really do think about that. What I will also say is this. Even though I was a Chief Diversity Officer and I set a lot of policies and I helped really work with our leaders to build some strong foundational capability. And one of the things that I was incredibly proud of early on when I worked with our General Counsel almost a decade ago is really the reality of how much brands can impact, others getting business, small business, procurement. I remember that he began to look at the law firms working on our business, right? Billable hours, that's how you got to be a partner. And so drove a huge effort around not just diversification of our lawyers, but really setting that expectation with law firms. And he ended up getting an award for that. And that, I think, is where I believe brands can really be much more impactful. It's not just who we donate our money to, but who we write checks to support our business. And so I do think that would be an area. But the thing that I really realized when I took over the foundation of Worldwide Corporate Affairs, I had staff in, I think, 22 countries. I had a huge staff. I got to make decisions every single day. And I sat in a chair where I really realized that HR and Chief Diversity Officers can only do so much. It is the thousands of decisions that leaders make, the dozens and hundreds per week that leaders make, who we give it opportunity to and who we don't, who we sponsor, who we don't, who we get the benefit of the doubt to and who we don't. A lot of research says that now one of the greatest levers on who gets opportunity and bias is who you're biased for. Because I've had a lot of people say, well, you know what? It's not that I don't have anything against Roz, but Skip I know what Skip's gonna do. And what happens is in crisis, in chaos, when you have to think fast, when everything's on the line, leaders make decisions that are safe and they don't take risk. And what I really saw was how powerful my decision making was in advancing the careers of an entire organization. And so what I saw was that the greatest seat in an organization to drive diversity and ultimate inclusion is the seat that controls resources, specifically headcount and people. Because that person makes decisions every single day. And so long answer, Skip, but I think it's a complex where you have policies and practices and things you have to rethink. You have to think about, how do I keep my best talent? How do I keep my best talent during this time? I was meeting with a CEO last week and I told him, I said, whether you realize it or not, every single one of your Black executives is being targeted to be recruited away from you right now. Every single one of them. And he said, well, what should I do? I said, well, the good news is you can get your arms around all of them, but you better start having conversations, because one of them is thinking of leaving you. And I found out that that's exactly what he did. And that's exactly what he found out, right? So there is this intentional, direct, and focus triage, but then also, but let's step back and recognize what would make them leave an organization. So, that's kind of, hopefully that answers it, but that's kind of where I sit when I think NASCA.
That's great. One question that I have too that came up a little bit earlier in this week that you touched on a little bit was compensation trends in the future as it relates to work, especially remote work. And some folks, workers in particular, are concerned that there's a movement where a lot of companies are going to be reducing salaries of people who live in lower cost areas based on cost of living, not necessarily how high performing or valuable that worker is. And I'm wondering, where do you see that trend going?
Yeah, well, a lot of companies have been doing the opposite for a long time in the Silicon Valley. They had a geo differential, so they were adding money, right, because it was so expensive. And so, I do see that is a trend, an emerging trend. And I believe when I go back to the future of work, it's going to be the future of what workers want. I think in the end, it's going to be dictated by supply and demand. I really do. I think those employees that can be readily replaced and who are unwilling to work at that level or who have to work at that level. So I really would pay more attention to market. I think the entire even though you can't always compare everything to professional sports, but I just think watching what's happening with all three and compensation and guaranteed contract versus not guaranteed contract and how many games, you see it playing out in a different industry. So my fear is that it is going to cause more compensation disparity, not parity. Because at the end of the day, I do believe the companies are going to pay talent what they need to get the job done. And where I think you may find some interesting correlations is it's going to relate to number of employees. How many employees do I really need moving forward? And so I wonder how that's going to play out. But my prediction is it will be implemented in various geographies potentially. You're going to have situations where employee privacy, I don't know, how do you really know that they move somewhere else? Maybe they have two homes. So I just think at a certain point, leaders may or may not care depending on how much money they stand to make or lose as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. One thing you mentioned was sort of advice for execs is they're thinking top down on how to make more transformational change within organizations. And earlier you also mentioned that there's multiple generations in the workplace, 4, sometimes 5 these days in some organizations. And execs are trying to figure out, how do they manage all those different generations? And you pointed out millennials as being particularly interesting because now they're assuming power, they're technically savvy, they have the ability to lead a movement here in terms of how they're acting as a unit in a distributed fashion using technology. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of what you're seeing in terms of insight and what that means for the C-suite and how they respond to their millennial workers, because you see more interest in employee resource groups. And so what are your thoughts there?
That's going to be really interesting. So understand that many CEOs are the ones who birthed or helped birth or grew these millennials. A lot of them are their kids. And so what's been interesting to me is historically when you found CEOs who were really committed to diversity, and when you really peeled back the onion, many times that was gender, it was really driven by their daughters. So I think there's been all kinds of research that said that CEOs, I think Catalyst did this, were very committed, it was their daughters. Okay, so if that plays out, then a lot of CEOs are getting pushed by their kids. Because the one thing that's been interesting as I've looked across is you've had rich kids next to poor kids, white, black, protesting on the same issue. And what's been interesting to me is to step back and think, okay, how are they demanding more of the adults that they talk to? And I believe that's where some of the push is coming from. We have had CEOs who didn't want to even touch the Black Lives Matter movement a few years ago, are literally putting out huge statements in support of Black Lives Matter. I don't think that came from just them waking up one day and making a change. I think it came from the protests, their employees, and I bet you many of them had a millennial at home or had a millennial that was a nephew or niece, and they got pushed. So when you get pushed from a community outside, you get pushed from your employees inside, you watch that video and you're outraged, and then you have your kids looking at you saying, well, what are you gonna do? And so I think that that's part of what's gonna happen. I also think that when you're dealing with a lot of generations in the workplace, from an HR tactical standpoint, you begin to deal with things like, you know, how tenure, how long someone's been there, how long they've been in this role. And I think the biggest challenge that organizations are going to have that are going to either keep their workforce flat or lower is if you're keeping your workforce flat, the reality is, and it's an unpopular reality, right? How do you really gain representation? How do you give more opportunity, right, if your workforce is flat? And so I think you're going to find much more complicated conversations going on around that, and much more challenging conversations that says, but that's why we've been tweaking. That's why we've been tweaking. We've been diversifying our polls. We've been following the law. We've been tweaking and tweaking and tweaking. But the world no longer wants you to tweak because people are tired of tweaking. And I think that is going to be the bigger issue that nobody really wants to talk about, versus the salary and compensation. Because I do believe that you're going to have all these generations in the workplace. And look, you have generations. I was one of them. Get to a place where we're ready to retire and somebody can take our place. And if we've done, you know, the work we should have done, we have a diverse pipeline of people who are ready to step up as people make a decision. You know what? I'm ready. I'm done. I'm gone. Okay, you have a diverse group of people, not all Black people, not all women. It includes everyone. But generally speaking, historically, that pool has included a whole lot of a few and one of the other, and it's got to have more than one. And so, you know, I just believe that we don't have all of the answers, but what I do believe is that we will continue to see, particularly in jobs that take academic skills and achievement, brain power, tech savvy, whether that's through school or whatever, you are going to see companies literally have to pay more attention. Because this is what I will tell you. Most companies were very surprised. Most leaders were very, very surprised at how quickly this all became protests in the streets. And what I have told them all is your Black employees were not surprised. And that is the beauty of having more diversity in the room. William Wolf, who was the chair emeritus of National Academy of Engineering, gave a speech on diversity, and he spoke very specifically about race in it. And what he talked about was our life experiences shape us. Engineering is an incredibly creative profession. And it demands us think about and pull from all of our life experiences the creativity that we bring to product development, to problem solving. And what happens when you don't have that in the room is, he called it an opportunity cost. The cost of an opportunity and design that you probably missed, that you didn't even know. The cost of an idea that you needed, but you didn't even know. The cost of being surprised by something and having to react and sitting in rooms of people that were surprised and finding out I have no one around me that can message this issue. That's the opportunity cost. And so I really believe that even though we have tremendous responsibility back from Emancipation Proclamation, end of Jim Crow, executive order, diversity, digital divide, Silicon Valley showing all their data, all of those things. I think the opportunity now is for us to really recognize that the time for incremental improvement is over with. It's going to take some pretty big swings.
Well, one thing that has come up among a lot of our CEOs too has been also how to deal with disparities in virtual environments when it comes to mental health and wellness of their employees. And I can't tell you the number of CEOs I've had conversations with in the last, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks in particular, where they're starting to have individual conversations with workers, and they're having to try and figure out, hey, how are you doing? You know, what's your home situation like? And sometimes people share a lot of information, and there's differences in terms of what people need across race, age, gender, and companies are having to be more in tune with their employees. And I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you would recommend execs pay attention to as they're trying to navigate this?
So, you know, it is interesting for me, and I totally understand that, and I think that it makes total sense, and it is an absolute positive that CEOs are recognizing this. Mental health has been an issue for Black employees forever. And every single time there was a shooting, every single time there were things in the news, the reality of data coming at you, mental health has been an issue. So, you know, some people say when the world catches a cold, you know, African American and Black people around the world catch pneumonia, and we've seen that in COVID. I think when it comes to mental health, there are some things that I think are going to be issues for CEOs in what is driving some of the mental health. Some people love being at home, some people don't. I have no idea how people are working from home, 2 career couples working from home with small children who you can't send anywhere. I don't know how they're doing it. And so I do believe that if they're going to think about a distributed work model, when people come back into the office, I'm shocked they have not created a distributed work model virtually. I'm really shocked. I think that would be one thing I would really be pushing. I know many are now trying to force people to take vacation. Many people are trying to say, hey, let's, you know, shut down and take some mental health time. And those are good. But you have to now think of, but how are people going to build their careers? Because the person that's still on 14 hours a day is going to have their career more advanced than the person that can only be on 6 hours a day because they have small children at home. You're exasperating it. So the mental health piece is part of the world is awful. Part of it is the stress and pressure. And part of it also is, I think you guys probably have data and have seen data that says people are actually working harder from home than they were in the office. More meetings, logged on more, because think about it, they aren't driving to and from work, so they literally wake up and log on, and they're on all day. So I do believe that some structural things around mental health, obviously from a benefit standpoint, providing mental health services. I think a lot of employees, quite frankly, don't feel comfortable going through mental health through their employers. So finding ways to really give confidence. I also think, quite frankly, that leaders themselves need some level of development. Not all leaders can have this kind of conversation with their employees, particularly those who don't have that humanistic side, very robotic. If you give them 3 questions, they'll ask it, but they'll ask it very robotic. And remember, WebEx is a close-up, so people will be able to tell if they're engaged or not. So I do believe there aren't any easy answers, but I do believe you have to think of processes, structures, and policies to recognize that your employees are struggling mentally. And if they aren't, their kids may be, their elder parents may be. And when I look at all the resources going, again, a foundation might be able to put some resources and dollars into places that can actually provide more services in this net. So for instance, a company that really has not invested deeply in mental health broadly might want to consider, you know what, part of our donation should go to an organization focused on mental health in geographies and communities that my employees are at. So even if they don't come through me, there's more resources out there that they can go to separately.
Thank you. I mean, I think that that's definitely an issue that's going to be something continually ongoing for a lot of our execs as they're trying to evolve and figure out how best to meet the challenges of this current time. So we're nearing the end of our hour, and Roz, I just want to say how grateful we are that you were able to take some time out of your busy schedule. I mean, you're, I know, advising people all over the world remotely now, and very sought after. So we appreciate that you were able to share some time and insight with our community here in Oregon. And love the ducks references. Well done. It's awesome. And thank you as well to all of you who are able to spend time with us as part of this session live. As I mentioned, we'll be sharing this out through all of our channels as well. I know we have a lot of people that are interested in this discussion with Roz, and we'll be soliciting their feedback in the coming days and weeks. And thank you again. Are there any closing thoughts that you wanted to leave us with, Roz?
Well, let's see. One funny closing thought, which is more housekeeping for those of you out there who may try and reach me through LinkedIn or my Twitter. Irony, both got hacked yesterday, and one of my emails got hacked. So if I don't respond for a while, please know that I'm not ignoring you. But if you absolutely positively really need to follow up with me, Skip, I'm going to send you something separately, and there'll be a way for that. But, you know, I believe, first of all, I just want to thank you for the invitation. I don't do this often, but when I get the chance to do it in front of leaders that can make a difference, I've retired from Intel, but I haven't retired from this. And I know that I have a perspective that sometimes may be unique. I hope that my directness and candor was valued, because I think it's important. But I think this group represents the segment that generally has always moved the world through. And I believe when tech gets it right, then everybody can get it right. And so I am incredibly hopeful. Really proud that you guys are going to break out. And I just think that my last kind of call to action for all of you is whatever you were thinking of doing, it must be as bold as the times dictate. People have taken to the streets. We have gaps we've had for 400 years, and millennials, the next generation that will lead this world, want better from us, and they're going to demand better from us. And they aren't waiting around another, 55 years, 1965, end of Jim Crow. They aren't waiting around another 55 years for us to get it right. And I'm thankful that we have them. So thank you. I'm really honored, and I so respect all of you and really have a lot of faith and hope in the ability of leaders to lead better on this issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Roz. We appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. For those who want